Hello everybody and welcome to Christchurch Art Gallery. We're going to have another bash at live streaming a talk about one of our artworks while we're closed, and we hope you enjoy this. It is today going to be Janet Abbott, our visitor host supervisor, who is going to talk about Harvesting St Ives, which is a landscape painting by Elizabeth Kelly, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Janet. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. So we're a bit of a tag team today. Tim did the Artbite last week, and that's really appropriate because Elizabeth Kelly, who we're looking at today, was, like Sydney Thompson, born in 1877. So they're contemporaries in the art scene in New Zealand and in Christchurch. And they knew a lot, they knew each other a lot. So when Elizabeth Kelly's husband was teaching at the Canterbury College School of Art, Sydney Thompson was also teaching at the Canterbury College School of Art when he came back to New Zealand. So they were contemporaries there, and the Kellys also lived in Sydney Thompson's house on Durham Street, I believe, at one point after World War I. So they certainly knew one another, and their practices were aligned in certain ways and different in other ways. Because this is an example of the Kellys actually going overseas for 1 year. Because of their practice, Elizabeth Kelly and Cecil Kelly, her husband, who were kind of joined at the hip and painted together and went together all the time to their painting destinations, they only got to go overseas for 1 year in 1921. And that's how we can date this painting. It's a painting that we didn't know too much about. So today's talk really is a talk about a tale of two journeys. One's the journey of the Kellys to their 1 year overseas, their grand tour, and their OE, I guess. And the other is the story of finding out about the painting. And that's the part of art history that I really love, is finding out the detective work, the tracking down, the making connections, the putting into context of these works. So I'll start off with Elizabeth Annie Kelly, known to her family as Annie, but in her professional life she called herself Elizabeth Kelly, or A. Elizabeth Kelly. She was born, as I said, in 1877, and she is 1 year older than her husband, who was born a year later. And she died in 1946, now that's just after World War II. And she really, so they painted through this period of basically from 1900 through to 1946, 2 world wars, the Depression, tricky times for artists. And we've got Frances Hodgkins in the art gallery at the moment, and she's painting through a similar period of time. So Elizabeth Kelly formed a practice of being a portrait painter in Christchurch, successful portrait painter, and she painted many formal portraits of the wealthy Christchurch residents and the beautiful Christchurch residents. Beautiful young women was her particular stock in trade. And she earned a CBE for her contribution to art in 1938. Lesser known amongst her oeuvre is the many landscapes she produced around the countryside, and she went out and about with Cecil, her husband. Now here's a photo I have of them. They had a place, their only place that they ever owned was a place in Moana, so that's on the lake in Moana, and there she is, and they've got their tent up because they never built on the section, and she's got her sandfly proof gear on there. And I always look for these oil paintings of Mount Brunner and such like, the other mountains around that area, and I always look for the sandflies stuck in the oil paint because I'm sure they must have been there. Anyway, so she does, she and Cecil go out pretty much every weekend, school holidays when Cecil's not teaching at the Canterbury College School of Art, and then overseas for a year. They were part of a group called the Canterbury Regional Painters, who painted en plein air, that's in the open air, and they painted landscapes that they sat in front of. So you don't find huge paintings like Bill Sutton's works, because they would have sort of blown off the easel in a good nor'wester. So Elizabeth and Cecil also painted further afield on the west coast, and if you can imagine the journey over to the west coast in 1920, the rail hadn't gone through to 1932, so they went on the train up to a certain part before Arthur's Pass, and then they took a coach and 5 with all their camping gear over to the west coast for the duration of the summer. May have rained a few days while they were over there. So exciting times for painters. They were adventurous, and having a male painting companion allowed Elizabeth to paint out of doors wherever they went. So they set up, they showed their work at the Canterbury Society of Arts and the NZAFA in Wellington, and Auckland Art Society, and the Dunedin Art Society, or the Otago Art Society, and they had a really good painting practice. But their lives were overtaken by World War I, and no one travelled overseas unless you were fighting during those days. And so when 1921 came around, Cecil got a year's leave from the Canterbury College School of Art, and they departed for Britain on the 29th of December 1920. And they were on board a ship called the Ionic, and that was to be, as I said, the only trip abroad. Once they got to London, they took rooms in Holland Street, Kensington, and Elizabeth set up a studio, painting a number of portraits of famous Kiwis in London at the time, Lady Patricia Blackwood, Mrs. F. Wilson, and the Honorary Mrs. Tahu Rose. And while they were in London, they visited all the artists they could visit. They visited the dealers. Their dealer was Bork and Sons, and they went to the galleries around the city, and that was the first time they'd actually seen a lot of the paintings, that European paintings, because they're painting in a European style of sorts that's adapted for New Zealand. In those days, the Canterbury College School of Art had a good library, but most of the pictures were in black and white. So it was a revelation to actually have the opportunity to see those works in London. They painted scenes around London, and we've got a couple of them in the collection. We've got an interior of St. Paul's, and you can see that on our website, and some bridges, bridge over Richmond and such like. When the summer of 1921 came round, the Kellys travelled down to Cornwall, and they took rooms in the picturesque fishing village of Cornish fishing village of St. Ives. And from the 1880s, the village had attracted many important plein air painters every summer. And it was rather like Tim talked about last week, which was, Sidney Thompson in the summer going to Concarneau, to the fishing village of Concarneau in France, and down to the south of France as well. And his bridge was basically down there. So it's very much part of your artistic practice to go to somewhere for your summer, to paint new landscapes, to get out of the city. And Cornwall, St. Ives Cornwall provided a much cheaper form of accommodation down there. And St. Ives was famous. It was said to be the largest and most significant artist colony in Britain, attracting both British and expatriate artists. And a number of New Zealanders went there. So we have William Menzies Gibbs, Dorothy Richmond, Margaret Stoddard worked there as well, and of course, most notably, Frances Hodgkins spent many years down there during World War I, 1914 to 1920. Those were the years she was down there. But when she was down there, she wasn't actually allowed to paint the scenes outside, because you might have been seen as a spy or something like that. So she painted portraits and interiors and still lifes and that sort of thing. So Frances Hodgkin sold her studio in October 1920, and she was finally able to travel back to France and then up through Britain. And so she missed the Kellys by a season. And you can see her, there's something in the letters of Frances Hodgkins, if you've got that book, on page 349. about Frances selling up her studio and moving off. The Kellys were allowed to paint outside when they were in St Ives, so they spent the summer out painting. We don't have, now this is part of the detective work of being an art historian, we don't have any journals or letters so far for this period. But their daily wanderings are recorded in the paintings they did around the town. And I've got a few of them here, but you probably won't be able to see them very well. But I've formed a wee folder, it's probably too shiny, of some of the paintings that they can. They did a lot of fishing boats, fishing, women gutting fish, more fishing boats with women working when the catch comes in. I can't see that one. And then in the village itself, you could get a model to model for you. So the fishing folk got a little bit of extra money from renting out their accommodation, but also for posing for the artists that were down there and renting out the studios and such like. So the wee girls here might have got a penny or something like that for posing in the picturesque fishing village with cobbled streets, and that's the market place there. And a lot of these works are in private collections around Canterbury and New Zealand. So loads of stuff. You can see lots of buildings, lots of churches, that sort of thing. So we've got quite a few of those, about 40 so far, but undoubtedly they painted more than that. So this is where this painting sits, in this part of their work where they're painting out of doors around Cornwall. And we didn't know where this was, so I got in touch with David Tovey, who is an art historian who works in Cornwall and has written many books on the Cornish fishing village of St Ives. And he suggests it's on the hillside above St Ives itself. Well, I don't know whether we can do this or not, but how are we doing here? So this is St Ives here, and there's a road that comes in from the other villages in here, and it's probably on the hillside somewhere up here, I think it is. Looking out, we can see the sea in the background, and we can see a bit of harvesting going on. All right, so it's possibly in the fields on the hill that led into St Ives, and it's a sunny pastoral scene showing people harvesting hay by hand. So they are doing it in the old-fashioned way without too much mechanical help, and it is 1921. She's captured the stalks of hay in the full sunlight of midday. And why would you paint some haystacks? Well, Monet painted a series of haystacks, a famous series of haystacks, with the light on the hay itself. And this takes me to the point of Impressionism. So obviously Monet's our chief impressionist, French impressionist. And Cecil, for instance, was well known by his students for insisting on capturing the exact light conditions of the moment. Bill Sutton tells a story of painting in Cecil's outdoor landscape class, and they had to bring the previous week's painting back to the same spot, and they were asked to repaint over the perfectly good painting. This was very unpopular with the students, and but they did it, and it did, Bill Sutton said, it did teach them to look and see the light conditions of the day once they got over themselves. So this Impressionist style of painting was undoubtedly the practice that Elizabeth used in this work. So you've got, it's a watercolour, but you've got quite bold brush strokes and sort of a very simplified foreground here. You've got the people working in there, and they're rendered with just a few strokes of paint and a little bit of white canvas there, I think. And then in the background you've got these windswept trees, which are a little bit, I think they're a little bit Art Nouveau-like. But it does suggest the much harsher nature of this sun-dappled hillside, when in winter the cold wind scours in from the west. And one of the reasons they went to Cornwall was it was noted for its clear light, and I think you have to think of that in the context of perhaps a little bit of smoke and pollution in London and the major cities around Britain. But here the westerly wind clears all that nonsense away, and you've got a beautiful clear British light there on a sunny day. And that blue bit of sea in the background there links us back to the coastal setting of St Ives. So after spending several months in Cornwall, the Kellys left for London, and they caught up with the autumn exhibitions there before they went on to Paris via Dieppe and Rouen. And they spent autumn in Paris, visiting the galleries and taking time to paint the scenes of Paris, including some arcades and some bridges over the Seine. A lot of bridges in their oeuvre, particularly Cecil's, very fond of bridges. So we saw a bridge last week. I think it was a thing going on. And the final part of this colonial grand tour for the Kellys was travelling down through Italy to join their ship in Naples. And the ship then called into ports in Cape Town, where they painted Cape Town, Melbourne, Sydney, and then they arrived in Wellington after a stormy passage across the Tasman on the 5th of January 1922, in time for teaching for the next year. So visiting Europe was a really important part of setting up your career. So there's a little bit of needing to go there to establish your credentials. Sidney Thompson obviously was lauded when he came back after having been in Paris and Concarneau, France. Well, first times anyway, until he got too modern. We didn't like too modern at that stage. And Elizabeth had also used her time in London to consolidate her relationship with her London dealer, Hawke & Son. And she sent her portraits of beautiful young women with very sort of elongate necks and very elegant women to the Royal Academy, the Salon in Paris, and many other venues, despite the onset of World War II. And when World War II did come to the world, a lot of painters got stuck over there and were put away in some basement, I imagine, until it was safe to ship works of art back. During the war, the Kellys went out and painted the landscape around Christchurch, around the hills, Governor's Bay, Taylor's Mistake, that sort of thing. So they carried on painting in that way. So that's just a little bit about harvesting St Ives. It sits in the middle of her career and is one of my favourites. Have we got any questions? From my very small audience.
Thanks, Jan.